Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're looking at 5 common mistakes that you can make when you're doing slip stitch patterns. Now, this includes regular slip stitch patterns that only use one color, or it can be slip stitch patterns that involve more than one color. We'll look at all of the mistakes that you can make and how to fix them. There are 2 that we'll talk about first that you have to pay attention to as you're knitting because there's no way to fix them afterwards. But the other ones are all fixable. If you look and you see you made a mistake a row or a few rows back, you can fix them, and we'll learn how in the video today. One very common problem when working slip stitch patterns, either regular slip stitch patterns or color work, is what happens when we slip stitches and we keep everything really tight and on the end of our needles. Like right here, I'm working this dice check pattern. I'm working this row right here. So when I'm slipping stitches, if I slip them and I'm keeping them really close to the tip of my needle and everything is bunched up tight right there and I'm pulling on my yarn, those stitches you can see already, it's bunched up on the needle right there. And that float is really short and it's not giving those stitches space to move. So as you're working your slip stitch pattern, whether it's in color work or even if it's in one color, when you're slipping stitches, spread them out a little bit to give that float that's going to be stranded either across the front or the back. I've got a picture here of a butterfly pattern where I strand the yarn across the front, and when I stranded it too tight, it bunched up on the butterfly, as you can see in the picture. So make sure when you slip your stitches, you're giving that yarn float some room in the back. So later on, those stitches aren't going to be puckered up. You'll be able to work them just fine, and the pattern will stay just as it is. So another common issue that is specific to color work, slip stitch work, is the yarn floats. I've carried these a specific way so it keeps that little barber pole effect to the back of the work, so you can't really see it from the front unless you really stretch it out. To do that, I drop the color I've just finished using, which is the blue. I just finished that. I'm going to drop that to the front. And the color I'm going to start with next, I bring up from behind. And doing that every time keeps that same look across the back, and it keeps the strand, that barber pole, towards the back. If we had reversed it, we'd see that across the front right here along the edge, and I'd rather not see that. So drop the color you finished with to the front, pick up the other color behind. The next thing to remember is how you're holding that yarn. You don't want to pull it really tight. If I insert and I start knitting, that yarn wasn't used for a few rows, and I give it a tug to make it tight, which sometimes we do on our edge stitches. What's going to happen is that float along the edge is going to pucker up. And if I keep doing that, this edge is going to get shorter and shorter because all of those floats are making the edge pucker and pull up on that side. So when you're changing colors, after you work that first stitch, here, I'll start it again. I like to hold it and just give the edge a little tug, and that helps loosen up the stitch and the float that's being carried back there, so it's not too tight. There's nothing you can do about it after the fact, so you have to be aware of fixing that right at the beginning. Now the first 2 things we discussed, slipping so the float is too tight or the edge stitch is pulled up, we really can't fix it after the fact, but the rest of these are fixes we can make without having to rip our work back. So this first one is when you miss a stitch that should have been slipped. Like right here, I should have slipped this stitch in this pattern and I forgot to slip it. Now instead of ripping out the 80 some stitches I have on here, what I can do is very simple. That should have been slipped. This is the stitch right here. It was on the row just below that I've just finished. So all I need to do is insert my needle into the right leg of that stitch and drop this one off. And that will make that float that should have been carried across the back. Now this is bulky yarn and that is really big and loose right now, but we'll talk about how we can fix that later. So that's the first thing you can do. If you miss a slipped stitch on the row just before, all you need to do, insert your needle into the leg of the stitch and drop that stitch just above right off. Now, what if you slipped the wrong stitch? Let me see here. That one slipped. 1, 2, 3. This is the stitch that should have been slipped, not this stitch. How can I fix this? Well, first off, we need to adjust this stitch. So to fix a stitch that shouldn't be slipped, find the float in the back, insert your needle into it and pop it right up there, just like that. So it leans off just like in that direction, off to the left. And take the stitch that shouldn't have been slipped up and over and drop it off. And look at that, we have a stitch. So I can knit that as normal, and this is the one that should have been slipped. So I will do just what I did with that first stitch. Insert into that leg there, drop this one off, and now I've fixed my pattern, which should have been slip, knit 3, slip a stitch, knit 3. Now those problems can occur in regular slip stitch patterns or in colorwork patterns. We'll take a look at that with a color pattern in a second. Okay, now the next thing is, what if you slipped a stitch and you held the yarn to the wrong side of the work? There's that float. That should have been on the inside. I don't want to see that on the outside. How can I fix that? All you need to do is you're going to pick up that float again, but this time you're sort of going to wiggle it around your stitch. And I'm just going to slide that stitch over and drop that float right there to the back. You see that? It was that simple. Now the float is on the back where it should be, and I continue my pattern, slipping a stitch and knitting across. Hey nerdy knitters, I just wanted to pop back in here and say I believe you can be a confident knitter, but it comes with understanding what's happening on your knitting needles. And in the case of these mistakes that you make in your slip stitch patterns, you really have to know what's going on so you can understand how to fix them. It just takes time and practice and really paying attention to what you're doing. If you agree, why don't you give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting. Now let's get back to our demonstration. Now let's look at some of these same mistakes, but in a colorwork pattern. This one's called bricks. All right, my first mistake here on this edge was I was following this row. It should have been knit 1, slip 1, and I forgot to slip the stitch right here. So I shouldn't have an orange stitch there. I should have a blue stitch right there. I can see that when I look further down in my pattern. There's that row of blue elongated stitches. So I can do just like I did with the last sample, even though this is color work. It's the same thing. I've inserted my needle. This is the stitch that should have been slipped. So I'll pop that on there and pull that float out. And now I fixed it. Okay, the next mistake I made, slip 1, and then it should have been knit 3. And I didn't knit 3, I slipped this one. I should have slipped this one. So I need to take this one out, and I need to slip that one instead. So this one should have been orange. So there's the float across the back, right there. So what I can do is pick that up, put it on the needle, and pull that blue over. And now I've fixed that stitch. And this one is the one that should have been slipped. So I'm going to look for the leg of the stitch, move this one over, and pop that one out. There, now I've fixed it. That's the pattern I should have. Slip 1, knit 3, slip 1, knit 3. Oh, and I did another mistake right there. That yarn shouldn't be, that float shouldn't be in the front. So just like we did for the solid color slip stitch pattern, so we just have to get this float to the back instead of the front. So I'll pick it up and I'm going to bring it up and over that stitch and slide that stitch over and push that float off. That's all there is to it. Now you can do these same fixes. If you've made a mistake further down, you'll just have to drop down that stitch right there. I prefer to use a crochet hook when I have to drop a lot. And you just do the same thing. You look at your pattern and see which stitches should have been slipped and which ones shouldn't. and you just fix the one stitch with your crochet hook. Drop down to where it needs to be and pick it right back up. And if you find that, let's look at this one again. If you have a tension issue where that, like those stitches, I've got really big floats right here where I had to fix that stitch. All you need to do is take your crochet hook or your needle, find that float, and you're just going to look at the stitches around it and sort of pull out some of that extra yarn over to the stitches on either side and give it a tug and adjust it. Where's that float? Right there. So find the row the float is on. Right there. And you can pull up the excess yarn and wiggle it across the row. Just like that. I'm working across the legs of those stitches, tugging and pulling, and that helps get rid of that excess yarn from the float. For more about slip stitch colorwork, see the video I've linked here at the end, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.